My husband packed the entire family into 2 SUVs for a luxury mountain retreat, left me a chore list instead of an invitation, and told me to water the tomatoes. The garage door was open when I came outside with my coffee. 2 SUVs sat in the driveway, both running, both loaded. Snowboard bags I paid for leaned against the tailgate of the Tahoe. Paige was laughing at something Dwight said, her duffel bag over one shoulder. Bailey was arguing with Walter about who got the aux cord. Nobody was arguing about a third seat for me. I stood on the porch in my robe and counted the bags. 4 duffels, 2 coolers, a cardboard box of wine I'd been saving. Nobody had packed for me because nobody expected me to come. Morning, Walter said, jogging up the steps 2 at a time. He had his sunglasses pushed up into his hair, the ones I bought him for our 15th anniversary. He smelled like the cologne Paige gave him last Christmas. Where's my bag? I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. He didn't stop moving. He patted my shoulder the way you'd pat a dog on your way out the door. You said last month the cabin trip stressed you out, remember? All those stairs at Sun River. I had said that once, 11 months ago, about a different trip, a different year, when my knee was still healing from surgery. I left you a list on my desk, he said. Nothing crazy. Water the tomatoes. They're about to come in. Bring the mail inside so it doesn't pile up. Susan next door said she'd loan you the Ring doorbell app if you want to keep an eye on the house. Walter, we'll be back Monday night. He was already walking backward toward the Tahoe. There's leftover chicken in the fridge. Love you. He didn't wait to hear if I loved him back. He got in the driver's seat and pulled out behind Dwight, and I watched both sets of taillights swing onto Brookwood Lane and disappear past the Hendersons' mailbox. I stood on the porch for a long time after the sound of the engines faded. The morning was warm for early September, the kind of warm that still smelled like cut grass instead of wood smoke. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler kicked on. I went inside and walked to Walter's home office, the room with the good chair and the framed photo of him cutting the ribbon at his clinic in 2005, the one where I'm cropped out of the corner because he said the composition looked better without me in it. On his desk, next to his laptop charger, was a single sheet of yellow legal paper. His handwriting, quick and slanted. Water tomatoes, every other day. Deep soak, bring in mail. Don't let it stack. Looks bad for the house, Susan's number if anything. With the alarm check on mom's plant in the sunroom. Don't forget trash Thursday. 21 years of marriage, condensed into 5 bullet points on a legal pad. I read it twice, waiting to feel something sharp. What I felt instead was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a long fall, right before you hit the ground. I set the list down exactly where I found it. Then I picked up my phone and called Susan. I had been 47 for 3 months when that list appeared on Walter's desk, but I had been disappearing for a lot longer than that. It happened so slowly I couldn't point to the day it started. There wasn't a day. There was just a long accumulation of small agreements, each one reasonable on its own, each one costing me a little more room in my own life. Walter and I met at a continuing education seminar in Eugene in the spring of 2003. I was 26, working nights as a freight dispatcher for a logistics company out of Bend, the kind of job that paid well because nobody wanted the hours. Walter was 29, a physical therapist 2 years out of his license, working for a chain clinic he hated and always talking about the practice he was going to build someday. Something with his name on the door, something that would matter. I liked that he had a plan. I liked that he looked at me like I was part of it. We married in October of 2004, a small ceremony at my aunt's place outside Redmond, 40 guests, a borrowed arch, string lights. Roger, my older brother, had strung up the night before while drinking a beer and telling me I could still back out. I laughed at him. I told him Walter was the most driven man I'd ever met, and driven men build things that last. I wasn't wrong about the driven part. In early 2005, Walter found a lease on a strip mall unit off 3rd Street in Bend, 600 square feet, cracked linoleum, a landlord named Grant Whitmore who wanted first and last plus a deposit before he'd hand over the keys. Walter's savings covered maybe a third of it. Mine covered the rest, $62,000, most of it from my grandmother's estate, the balance from 3 years of overnight freight shifts I'd been banking without spending. I signed the lease alongside him. Grant made sure of it. He said a business needs 2 names on the paper in case one of you gets hit by a bus. No offense intended. I remember laughing at that too. Crestline Rehabilitation opened in June of 2005. I kept working nights at the freight company for 6 more years after that because the clinic couldn't carry health insurance for both of us yet, because somebody needed a paycheck that didn't depend on how many patients walked through Walter's door that month. I dispatched trucks from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, came home, slept until early afternoon, and spent my evenings doing the clinic's books at our kitchen table because Walter said he trusted my numbers more than any bookkeeper he could hire. I missed things. I missed a lot of things. I missed my brother Roger's wedding in August of 2007 because Walter's grand opening for the second Crestline location, the one in Redmond, fell on the same weekend, and he told me investors would be there, and investors needed to see both of us standing together, a united front, a real family business. I sent Roger and Wendy a KitchenAid toaster instead of showing up. $41 at the Fred Meyer on 3rd Street. I still remember the receipt. Roger didn't call me for almost a year after that. I told myself it was worth it. I told myself Walter and I were building something, and building things requires sacrifice, and sacrifice isn't the same as disappearing. I believed that for a long time. I believed it right up until the year Dwight moved into our basement. Dwight was Walter's younger brother, 44 the year he arrived. 3 years and 2 failed businesses behind Walter his whole life. He'd run a barbecue restaurant restaurant outside Boise that folded in the spring of 2019, then a food truck that folded that same fall, and by November he was standing on our porch with 2 duffel bags and a story about a temporary rough patch. "Just until I'm back on my feet," Dwight said. "A month, maybe 2. The month turned into 14. Dwight didn't pay rent. He didn't buy groceries unless you counted the 2-liter bottles of soda he restocked in the garage fridge. On our 17th anniversary, in October of 2020, I opened the wine cabinet to get the bottle I'd been saving since our honeymoon, a 2003 vintage I'd bought at a little shop in Sonoma, and told myself I'd open on our 20th. It was gone. Dwight had found it 3 weeks earlier, he said, while looking for a beer, and figured it had been sitting there so long nobody wanted it anymore. I told Walter I was upset, not furious. Upset, which is the version of furious a woman learns to perform when she still believes the marriage is worth protecting. "He's going through a lot right now," Walter said. "Can you just give him some grace? It's a bottle of wine, Elena." It wasn't a bottle of wine. It was 17 years, uncorked by a man who didn't know what it cost, and a husband who didn't think it was worth defending. But I nodded, because that was the shape our marriage had taken by then. I absorbed things. I stopped complaining, and I told myself the silence I'd built was peace, when really it was just erosion with better manners. That was the earlier incident I should have paid more attention to, not the wine itself, the way Walter asked me to shrink around it, so smoothly I barely noticed I'd agreed. By the time Dwight had been in our basement for 4 years, he wasn't a guest anymore. He was furniture. He ate dinner with us most nights, laughed at Walter's jokes a beat too hard, called our daughters kiddo like he'd earned the nickname instead of borrowing it from a man who actually had. Bailey, 24 that September and living in Portland, still came home most weekends and treated Dwight like a fun uncle, instead of a 48-year-old man who'd been living rent-free in her parents' basement for half a decade. Paige, 20 and home from college for the summer, thought he was hilarious. I was the only one in the house who still did the math on what his groceries cost, what his cable package cost, what the 14 months turned 5 years actually meant. I want to be honest about my part in it. I let it happen. Every time I could have drawn a line, I drew a softer one instead, told myself I was being the bigger person, told myself Walter needed me to be easy to live with more than he needed me to be honest. 21 years is a long time to practice getting smaller. By the morning those 2 SUVs pulled out of my driveway, I'd gotten so good at it that my own husband could look me in the eye and hand me a chore list instead of a suitcase, and some small, tired part of me almost understood why he thought that would be fine. Almost. The first time I really noticed the pattern, the actual shape of it, was the spring before the retreat, when Walter told me he wanted to add Dwight to the clinic's payroll as a wellness consultant. "He doesn't have a license," I said. "He doesn't have any background in this at all. He's good with people," Walter said. "He can work the front desk, greet patients, keep the energy up. It'll be good for him. Structure, purpose." I pointed out that Dwight had never once, in 5 years under our roof, kept a consistent schedule for anything. Walter said I was being negative. He said Dwight had been through enough without me piling on. He said this while standing in the kitchen I'd renovated with money from 6 years of overnight shifts, and I remember thinking, distantly, that I recognized the tone. It was the tone he used the year I asked why Bailey's college fund had a smaller balance than the projections we'd made when she was 10. That's structure and purpose too, apparently. A euphemism for money moving somewhere I wasn't supposed to ask about. Dwight started at the clinic in April, $22 an hour, cash some weeks according to the receptionist Marisol, who mentioned it to me once at a barbecue and then looked like she regretted saying anything. I brought it up to Walter. He said Marisol didn't understand payroll and I shouldn't gossip with staff about clinic finances. That was the first ceiling. I told myself, fine, it's his brother, it's his business, it's $22 an hour, it's not worth the fight. I believed the ceiling would hold. It didn't hold for long. In May, Walter told me he was taking out a small business loan to open a 3rd location in Redmond, expanding the sports medicine wing. He needed my signature as co-owner on the paperwork. Standard stuff, he said. Nothing to worry about. I read every page before I signed. $60,000, reasonable terms, a repayment schedule that made sense against the clinic's revenue. I signed it because the numbers were real, and the plan was sound. And I still, at that point, believed my husband told me the truth about money, even if he'd stopped telling me the truth about almost everything else. That was the second ceiling. It held for 6 weeks. In late June, Bailey called me crying. She and Walter had gotten into an argument about her boyfriend, a guy named Colton she'd been dating since February, and Walter had said something about Colton's family that Bailey found insulting. She wanted me to talk to him, smooth it over, the way I'd smoothed over 100 small fights between the two of them since she was a teenager. I called Walter. He didn't want to talk about Colton. He wanted to talk about how exhausted he was, how nobody understood the pressure of running 3 locations, how Dwight was the only person in the family who actually showed up for him without an agenda. I have an agenda? I asked. You always have an agenda, Elena. Everything's a transaction with you. I do this, so you owe me that. 21 years of freight shifts and clinic books and missed weddings, and I was the one with a transactional streak. I hung up the phone and sat in my car in the Fred Meyer parking lot for 11 minutes before I could make myself drive home. That was the 3rd ceiling, and it wasn't really about Bailey or Colton at all. It was about Walter learning, slowly and then all at once, that if he framed any complaint I had as me keeping score, I would spend the next hour proving I wasn't the kind of woman who kept score. He'd found a lever. Guilt, wrapped in the language of intimacy. You always have an agenda. Nobody understands the pressure. If you loved me the way Dwight loves this family, you wouldn't ask so many questions. In July, Paige came home from her sophomore year at the University of Oregon and mentioned, almost in passing, that her financial aid package had gotten smaller because the FAFSA showed our household assets had increased. I hadn't seen anything about increased household assets. I asked Walter about it at dinner, in front of the girls, because by then I'd started asking questions in rooms where he couldn't quietly deflect me. It's the equity line, he said. On the Redmond building. It's a paper number, Elena. It doesn't mean anything real. What equity line? The one we talked about. We had not talked about it. I know because I keep a small spiral notebook, the kind you can buy for $1 at any drugstore, where I write down dates and numbers when something feels slightly off. It's not paranoia. It's just a habit freight dispatchers get into, logging things, because a missing shipment is a lot easier to trace if somebody wrote down the time it left the dock. I'd started the notebook 8 months earlier, after the Dwight payroll conversation, without fully admitting to myself why. There was no equity line entry in my notebook because there had been no conversation. I let it go that night in front of the girls because I didn't want Paige to watch her parents fight about money on the first evening she was home in 4 months, but I wrote it down later. Equity line, Redmond, never discussed, July 14th. That was the fourth ceiling, and it was the one where I stopped believing him by default. I still smiled at dinner. I still packed his lunches for the clinic 3 days a week, but somewhere in July, a part of me that had been asleep for a very long time opened one eye and started paying attention. The fifth ceiling came in August, 10 days before the retreat, and it was the smallest one on paper and the one that hurt the most in practice. Walter came home from the clinic and mentioned, casually, that Trent Holloway, a friend of Dwight's from Boise, a notary who did some freelance paperwork on the side, was going to help him clean up some signature stuff on a few older documents. I asked what documents. He said boring refinance paperwork, nothing that involved me, don't worry about it. I wrote it down. Trent Holloway, notary, signature stuff. Walter says, don't worry. August 21st. I didn't think much of it at the time. It sounded like exactly the kind of vague, condescending non-answer Walter had been giving me for months. I filed it next to the equity line and the payroll cash and Bailey's smaller aid package. 4 small facts that didn't add up to anything I could name yet, just a low hum under the floor of my life that told me something structural was cracking, even if I couldn't see where. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I didn't know, standing in my kitchen with Walter's laptop charger cord in my hand, that Trent's name would come back to me 3 weeks later and knock the air clean out of my lungs. I just knew I was tired of being told not to worry. I'd been not worrying, competently and gracefully, for 21 years, and it had gotten me a chore list on a legal pad while my family loaded snowboards I'd paid for into a truck without me. That was the morning of the retreat, September the 4th, and it was the 6th ceiling. And I didn't wait to see if Walter would break through it. I broke it myself. I stood in his office for maybe 90 seconds after reading the list. Then I called Susan Okafor, my closest friend since our freshman year at Oregon State, who'd moved to Seattle a decade earlier for a marketing job and stayed for a life that actually seemed to belong to her. Come, she said, before I'd even finished the sentence. I'll make up the guest bed. What Susan didn't know, what nobody but Harold Benson and Diane Ferris knew, was that I hadn't decided to leave that morning. I'd decided 9 months earlier in December, sitting in my car outside a Les Schwab while my tires were being rotated, doing math on a napkin about my mother's inheritance and what it would cost to protect it. My mother, Ruth, had passed in the spring of 2023 and left me $310,000, most of it from the sale of the house I grew up in outside Prineville. Walter had suggested, gently, that we roll it into the clinic's expansion fund, so it's working for us instead of just sitting there. I told him I wanted to think about it. I thought about it for 8 months quietly, while the equity line and the payroll cash and Bailey's aid package piled up in a notebook he didn't know existed. In January, I hired Harold Benson, a forensic accountant a coworker from my old freight job had used during her own divorce. In February, I hired Diane Ferris, an attorney with a reputation for representing women whose husbands thought money was a language only they were fluent in. I moved my mother's inheritance into a trust Diane set up, invisible to any joint account Walter could see. I kept driving him to the clinic. I kept packing his lunches. I kept smiling at Dwight across the dinner table while a part of me, quiet and patient, built an exit nobody in that house could see coming. 9 months of planning, and it all came down to a legal pad with 5 bullet points about tomatoes. I threw 4 bags in my car in 11 minutes. I didn't take much. Clothes, my mother's jewelry box, the spiral notebook, the folder Harold had given me with copies of everything he'd found so far. I left the good china. I left the wedding photos. I left the framed picture of Walter cutting a ribbon with me cropped out of the corner, because some parts of a marriage you don't need to carry with you when you go. I drove east out of Bend on Highway 20, then north, then east again, 600 miles toward Seattle by way of a route that made no sense except that I needed the miles, needed the time behind the wheel to let my hands stop shaking. Somewhere around Burns, deep in the flat brown middle of Oregon, I called Diane and told her it was time. File whatever needs filing, I said. I'm not going back. In Idaho, just past the border on Highway 95, I pulled into a gas station, bought a coffee I didn't drink, and dropped my phone into the trash can by the pump. months. I'd bought a second phone weeks earlier, a plain prepaid one, and I didn't power it on until I was 200 miles further, parked outside Susan's house in Wallingford, the porch light on, her silhouette already in the doorway. Walter didn't notice I was gone until Sunday night, 2 full days into a 4-day retreat, surrounded by our daughters, his brother, snowboards and coolers, and the wine I'd been saving, and it took him 48 hours to realize his wife hadn't texted, hadn't called, hadn't watered the tomatoes. I know exactly when he noticed because Diane's process server was already waiting. Sunday at 8:15, Walter opened the front door of the rental cabin expecting a pizza delivery and found a man in a windbreaker holding an envelope with his name on it instead. I wasn't there to see his face. Susan and I were in her kitchen in Seattle, eating takeout pad thai off paper plates, and Bailey texted a photo of it to the family group chat with 3 exclamation points and no explanation, and I watched my husband's whole carefully arranged weekend crack open from 400 miles away. I thought I'd feel something enormous. Vindication, maybe, or relief, or the kind of clean, sharp satisfaction you see in movies when the wronged woman finally gets her moment. What I actually felt was tired. Bone deep, 21 years deep tired. The kind of tired that doesn't lift just because you finally stopped carrying the weight. I went to bed at 9:30 that night in Susan's guest room, under a quilt that smelled like someone else's laundry detergent, and I slept for 11 hours, longer than I'd slept in a single stretch since before Paige was born. Monday morning, my phone, the real one, the prepaid one only Diane and Susan and Harold had the number for, rang before 8. It was Diane, and her voice had the particular flatness of a lawyer about to deliver bad news carefully. "Elena, I need you to sit down." I was already sitting at Susan's kitchen island, a mug of coffee cooling in front of me. "Go ahead." Harold pulled the clinic's operating account activity for August. $140,000 was wired out on August 29th, 6 days before you left. My stomach dropped the way it does on the first hill of a roller coaster, that half second where your body knows before your mind catches up. Wired where? A company called Crestline Sports Recovery LLC, registered in Oregon on August 22nd. The listed manager is Dwight Marsh. Dwight, who hadn't had a functioning bank account in over a decade. Dwight, who'd been drinking my anniversary wine and eating cash payroll for 5 years and calling my daughter's kiddo like he'd earned it. Dwight, apparently, now owned 80% of a company that had swallowed $140,000 of clinic money 6 days before my husband handed me a list about tomatoes. "Walter's calling it a loan," Diane said. "From Dwight to the clinic, structured backward on paper, to look like Dwight is now owed an ownership stake for capital he contributed. Except Dwight didn't contribute anything. The money moved the other direction. Harold's pulling the wire records now, but it looks like Walter drained the account and used your husband's own brother as a shell to make the withdrawal look like an investment instead of a theft." I thought about April. $22 an hour, cash some weeks, structure and purpose. I thought about May, the loan I'd signed because the numbers looked sound. I thought about the equity line in July that had never been a real conversation, and Trent Holloway's name in my notebook from 3 weeks earlier, signature stuff, don't worry about it. I hadn't known what I was watching build. I'd just known, in my gut, that something was being built. "There's more," Diane said, and I could hear her choosing her words the way you choose your steps on ice. "I don't want you to hear this from anyone but me. Bailey emailed you last night." Susan slid her laptop across the island without a word, already open to my inbox. The subject line read, "Are you even seeing this?" I opened it and read it once, then a second time, because the first reading didn't feel real. "Dad is a wreck," it said. "He's been trying to reach you for 2 days, and you just disappeared like a coward. Dwight said you probably planned this whole thing for months, that you're punishing everyone because you're going through something. How could you do this to us in front of Paige? You're sick, Mom. Actually sick. 24 years old, and my daughter had already decided the story. I had spent 2 decades protecting Walter's image in front of her, smoothing the edges of every fight, absorbing every unfairness so she'd never have to see her father the way I sometimes did. I had done such a thorough job that when the truth finally surfaced, she reached for the version where I was the villain, because that version was familiar, and the real one wasn't. Diane told me not to respond. "Don't defend yourself to Bailey yet," she said. "Not until we have documentation she can't argue with. Right now it's your word against a very sympathetic performance. Find the paper trail. Everything else waits." I didn't sleep well that night either. Tuesday brought worse news, though I wouldn't have believed that was possible 24 hours earlier. Paige called me a little after 10 at night, her voice pitched low, the particular whisper of someone standing in a bathroom with the fan running so nobody in the next room can hear. "Mom, something happened. I don't want you to freak out. Walter had thrown a glass at the retreat," she said. "Not at anyone, just against the stone fireplace in the cabin's great room. Hard enough that Dwight had to sweep glass out of the rug for 20 minutes. He'd been drinking since the process server left on Sunday, and by Tuesday evening he'd told Bailey, in front of Paige and Dwight, that the reason I'd left so suddenly, the reason I'd hired a lawyer before I'd even packed a bag, was that I was having an affair with my accountant. He said your accountant's name," Paige whispered. "Harold something. He said you two had been meeting for months, and the whole divorce thing was really about that." Bailey believed him, Mom. She's furious. She got in her car 20 minutes ago and said she was driving to his office right now to confront him. Harold Benson kept his practice in a small professional building off Reed Market Road, the kind of place with a shared lobby and a security desk that closed at 6. I called him immediately. It was almost 10:30, and I fully expected to reach his voicemail. He picked up on the second ring. "Elena, I'm still here," he said before I could even explain. "There's a young woman in the lobby right now demanding to see me. Security's got her at the front desk. Is this your daughter?" "Bailey, 24, dark hair, about 5'6". "Please don't let her leave upset, just—" I didn't even know what I was asking for. "I've got this," Harold said. "Let me handle it. I'll call you back." He called back 40 minutes later. He'd come down to the lobby himself, he said, sat Bailey down at the little round table by the elevators, and laid out exactly what their professional relationship consisted of. 3 meetings, always during business hours, always about wire transfers and account statements, never once alone anywhere but a conference room with a glass wall facing the hallway. He'd shown her his call log, he'd shown her his calendar, he'd told her gently that he understood why her father's version had felt true, because grief and confusion make almost anything feel true if it's handed to you by someone you love. She broke down, Harold said, right there in the lobby. I think some part of her already suspected he was lying. She just didn't want to be the one to say it out loud. I should have felt relief. I did feel relief, underneath everything else. But mostly I felt something colder settling into my chest, the recognition that my husband, cornered for the first time in 21 years, hadn't reached for honesty. He'd reached for the most damaging story he could hand our daughter, and he hadn't hesitated for a second before handing it to her. Then Harold said the thing that changed the shape of everything that came after. "Elena, while I had you on the phone Sunday, something about the timeline bothered me. I pulled a title search on your house this morning. Just instinct. I wanted to see if there'd been any liens filed recently that wouldn't show up on the regular credit reports yet. And there's a recorded deed of trust from July 29th, $250,000 against your house, the one that's been paid off since 2019. Both names are on it, yours and Walter's." My hands went cold around the phone. "I never signed anything in July. I would remember $250,000. "I know," Harold said quietly. "I pulled the notary stamp off the recorded copy. It's a man named Trent Holloway." I sat down on the edge of Susan's guest bed. The prepaid phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark. Trent Holloway. Signature stuff. Don't worry about it. August 21st, written in my own handwriting in a dollar store notebook, 3 weeks before I even understood what I'd been documenting. "He forged my signature," I said, and saying it out loud made it real in a way the number on the page hadn't quite managed. "That's what it looks like," Harold said. "Combined with the $140,000 that went to Dwight's shell company, you're looking at close to $400,000 moved out of joint and marital assets in about 5 weeks, most of it structured to look legitimate on paper. And because your name is on that deed of trust, whether you signed it or not, you're currently, legally, on the hook for half of it until we can prove the forgery. $400,000. Not a number I could argue my way around. Not a misunderstanding. Not Walter being sloppy with the books the way he sometimes was. A plan. Methodical, specific, and timed to close right before he loaded 2 SUVs and drove away without me. I need the original 2005 documentation," Harold said. "The lease, the funding records, anything that proves you put $62,000 of your own money into that clinic at the start. If this goes the way I think it's going, Walter's lawyer is going to argue the clinic and everything built off it belongs primarily to him. We need paper that says otherwise, and we need it before Diane files the injunction." The bank that had processed my original cashier's check in 2005 had been bought out twice since then and folded entirely in 2016. My own copies had been in a filing cabinet in Walter's office, the one room in the house I hadn't thought to raid on my way out the door. My only real lead was a dead man's paperwork and a brother I hadn't spoken to in 4 years. Grant Whitmore, our original landlord, had passed away in 2021. His daughter, when I finally tracked down her number through the property management company that still handled the building, told me over the phone that her father had kept meticulous records of every tenant he'd ever had, boxes of them, and that most of the old files had gone to whoever helped him with his bookkeeping toward the end. "That would have been my Uncle Roger," she said. "Roger Bryant. He used to help Dad with the books on the side back when he still lived up here." Roger. My brother. The man I'd sent a $41 toaster instead of showing up for at his own wedding. I hadn't spoken to Roger in 4 years, not since a Thanksgiving argument in 2021 about whether I'd even try to make it to Wendy's 40th birthday. An argument I'd lost by simply not showing up again because Walter needed me for a clinic staff appreciation dinner that turned out later to have been entirely optional. I drove to Portland on Wednesday morning in a rain that never let up the entire 3 hours. The kind of steady Pacific Northwest rain that makes everything outside the windshield look like it's dissolving. I hadn't called ahead. I wasn't sure Roger would pick up if I did. Wendy answered the door. She looked at me for a long moment before she said anything, taking in, I imagined, the fact that I'd shown up unannounced after 4 years of silence, soaking wet, holding nothing but my car keys and a manila folder. "We got a toaster," she said, flat, not moving from the doorway. "You couldn't even show up to our wedding, Elena, 14 years ago, and I still remember unwrapping that box." "I know," I said. "I've known for 14 years. I'm not here to make excuses. I need Roger's help, and I understand if you tell me to turn around and drive back to Bend." She looked at me another few seconds, then stepped aside. "He's in the garage. Attic stuff. He'll want to hear this from you, not from me." Roger came down from the attic with 3 cardboard boxes stacked in his arms, dust in his gray-streaked hair, and set them on the workbench without a word of greeting beyond respond a nod. He was 51 that year, heavier than I remembered, with the particular weariness of a man who'd absorbed a lot of family disappointment and stopped being surprised by new arrivals of it. Grant kept everything, he said, wiping dust off the top box with his forearm. Every lease, every ledger, every tenant file back to the 90s. I helped him organize it all the year before he passed, mostly so his daughter wouldn't have to deal with it alone. I figured someday somebody might need proof of something. Didn't figure it'd be you. Inside the second box, in a manila folder labeled Crestline, 3rd St, 2005, I found the original lease, my signature on the second page alongside Walter's, dated June the 3rd, 2005. Behind it, a photocopy of a cashier's check for $62,000, my name on the remitter line, deposited into the clinic's opening account 4 days before the doors opened. Grant had noted the date received in the margin, in blue ink, the careful handwriting of a landlord who didn't trust verbal agreements. And behind that, folded twice, a letter I had never seen before in my life. It was dated April of 2006, 10 months after the clinic opened, typed on Walter's letterhead. In it, he asked Grant, formally, whether it would be possible to amend the lease to remove my name from the paperwork entirely, to simplify ownership structure going forward as the business scales. He offered no explanation for why. Grant had written a reply in red ink across the bottom of Walter's own letter, short and final. Both names stay on the lease or the lease is void. Take it or leave it. GW. Walter had wanted my name off the paper 10 months after I put $62,000 into his dream. 18 years before he handed me a legal pad about tomatoes, he had already started trying to erase me. Grant Whitmore, a landlord I'd met maybe 4 times in my life, had refused to let him. I stood in Roger's garage holding a dead man's red ink and felt something shift permanently in my chest. Not surprise, exactly. Confirmation. The floor I'd suspected was cracking for months had, in fact, been cracked since the 2nd year of my marriage, and I simply hadn't been shown the paperwork. My phone buzzed while I was still standing there. A text from Paige. Bailey packed 2 suitcases and left the cabin without telling anyone where she was going. She won't answer Dad. Dwight's outside loading his motorcycle onto his trailer. He's leaving too. Dad's standing in the driveway by himself. I don't know what to do. I told Paige to pack her own bag, grab her passport in case anything about the house situation got legally complicated, and drive straight to Susan's in Seattle. Then I thanked Roger, and for the first time in 4 years, my brother hugged me before I left, tight and quick, the way men in our family hugged when they meant it and didn't have the words for it. Go get what's yours, he said. I'll box the rest of this up and ship it to whoever needs it. Lawyer's office, wherever. I drove back towards Seattle instead of Bend, the manila folder on the passenger seat like a second person riding along. 3 hours of highway and rain and a ledger that had waited 18 years to be found. I was an hour outside Portland, the wipers still going, when my phone lit up on the dashboard mount. Not the family group chat, not Paige, not Diane, not Susan. A text from Walter's number directly, routed to a phone he shouldn't have known existed, a number I'd given to exactly 3 people. I know you went to Portland, it read. I know about the ledger. Dwight's gone. Bailey's gone. I have nothing left to lose. File that injunction tomorrow, and I go straight to the police about the tax returns you signed. You know exactly what I mean. My hands went cold on the wheel. I knew, in a general way, that Walter had handled the joint tax filings for the last several years, that I'd signed what he put in front of me because I'd trusted the man across the table from me at the kitchen counter every April. I had no idea, sitting in that car on Highway 26 with rain streaking sideways across the windshield, whether there was anything real behind the threat or whether it was one more manipulation, dressed up to sound like leverage. What I did know was that a man who believed he had nothing left to lose was the most dangerous version of Walter I had ever encountered. 21 years, and I had never once heard him talk like this. Calm men don't threaten prison time over text message. Cornered ones do. I pulled the car onto the shoulder, hazards ticking, rain drumming on the roof, and picked up the phone to call Diane. My thumb was over her contact photo when a second text landed underneath the first, 4 words long, and it hit me harder than the entire message before it. Ask Dwight about Trent. I called Dwight before I called Diane. My hands were shaking so badly I fumbled the contact twice before the call connected. He picked up on the first ring, like he'd been sitting there staring at his phone waiting for someone to call him. Elena, his voice sounded wrecked, thinner than I'd ever heard it. I didn't know how else to reach you. Walter's phone was sitting on the counter at the gas station in Shemalt. I saw what he sent you, and I typed the second part before I could think about it. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have used his phone. I didn't know what else to do. Tell me about Trent, I said. Tell me right now. There was a long pause, long enough that I could hear a gas pump running somewhere behind him, the tinny sound of a convenience store radio. Trent's been doing side work for Walter since spring, he finally said, notarizing things. I didn't ask a lot of questions, Elena, and I know how that sounds. Walter told me back in July that he needed to put the new recovery clinic under a company name for tax reasons, and he needed a family member to be the listed manager because banks like seeing a real name attached instead of just him again. He said it was a formality. He said it protected the family. Did you sign anything? I signed a bunch of stuff at the kitchen table in July. He had it all printed out, tabs on the pages where I needed to initial. I didn't read every line, Elena. I trusted my brother. His voice cracked on the last 2 words. Yesterday, at the cabin, Trent called me. Not Walter. Trent. He'd been drinking, I could tell, and he told me he felt sick about something and and needed to get it off his chest. He said Walter had structured the LLC paperwork so that I'm listed as sole managing member with 80% ownership, not as a formality, as the actual legal owner. If anybody ever traces that $140,000 back to fraud, it doesn't touch Walter's name anywhere. It's my signature on every filing. It's my name the bank calls. It would be me, Elena, not him. I sat very still on the shoulder of Highway 26, rain hammering the roof, and let that settle into place alongside everything else I'd learned in the last 4 days. Walter hadn't just siphoned money out of a marriage he intended to end. He had built a structure, patient and specific, where his own brother would absorb the legal weight of it if the whole thing ever came apart. Dwight wasn't a co-conspirator. Dwight was insurance, purchased with 5 years of free rent and a made-up job title. A man who'd been told he finally mattered to this family right up until the moment he became useful for something much darker than payroll. And the loan on the house, I said. The forged one. Was that Trent too? I don't know the details on that one, Dwight said. I swear to you, Elena, I didn't know about your signature. I found out about the house loan the same night you did, from Paige, when she told me what her sister found out from your accountant. I've been sick about it ever since. I packed up my trailer this morning because I can't sit in that cabin next to him anymore. I don't know what I'm going to do about any of this, but I wanted you to know the truth before your lawyer files whatever she's filing. I'll say all of it, on paper, in front of anybody. I don't care what it costs me with Walter anymore. He was never protecting me. He was aiming me. I thanked him. I meant it more than I expected to. Somewhere in the last 4 days, without meaning to, I had stopped being able to sort the people around me into simple categories of villain and victim. Dwight had drunk my wine and eaten cash payroll and called my daughter's kiddo like he'd earned it. And he had also just handed me, unprompted, the exact piece of proof that would keep his brother from destroying the rest of my life. People are rarely only one thing. Walter had spent 21 years teaching me that lesson in the worst possible way. Dwight, by accident, taught me a gentler version of it on the side of a rain-soaked highway. I called Diane next and relayed everything. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a lawyer recalculating a strategy in real time. This changes the injunction filing, she said. If Dwight is willing to give a sworn statement about the LLC structure and Trent's involvement, we're not fighting a messy, he said, she said, about a family loan anymore. We're looking at fraud, forgery, and possible wire fraud charges that Walter tried to route through his own brother. File tomorrow morning like we planned. But I want Dwight's statement in writing before end of day if you can get it. I could get it. Dwight met me at a Denny's off the highway outside Madras 2 hours later, his trailer still hitched to his truck in the parking lot, and gave a full statement into Harold's recorder while eating a plate of eggs he barely touched. He signed it in front of a different notary, one Diane found through her own office, just to be safe. Then he hugged me, awkward and quick, the way people hug when they're not sure they've earned the right to, and told me he was driving to a friend's place in Nampa and didn't know when he'd talk to Walter again. For what it's worth, he said, you didn't disappear because you were sick. You disappeared because you were the only person in that house paying attention. I should have been paying attention too. I'm sorry it took me this long. The confrontation happened 4 days later, on a Tuesday, in the kitchen I'd renovated with 6 years of overnight freight money. I hadn't planned to be there. Diane had arranged a meeting to formalize the injunction and the asset freeze, and Walter, through his own lawyer, had insisted it happen in person at the house instead of an office, said he wanted a chance to talk like adults, not through paperwork. Diane agreed on the condition that she and Harold both attended. I agreed on the condition that I got to say what I needed to say, in my own words, before anyone signed anything. I didn't expect Bailey and Paige to be there. Paige told me later she'd called her sister the moment she found out about the meeting, and Bailey, 3 days removed from her own confrontation with the truth in Harold's office lobby, had driven up from Portland without telling anyone she was coming until she was already standing in the driveway. Walter looked smaller than I remembered him, standing in his own kitchen. Not physically. Something else. Something that had drained out of him in the 4 days since the cabin. He still tried the old moves at first. The same tone he'd used on me for 2 decades. Warm and reasonable and faintly disappointed. Like I was the one who'd overreacted to a misunderstanding. Elena, I think we can handle this like grown-ups, he said, glancing at Diane and Harold with a tight performative smile. I know things got messy. I know I said some things at the cabin I regret, but we built a life together. 21 years. Doesn't that count for something in how we handle the next part? It counted, I said. For 21 years, it counted more than anything. That's why it worked on me for so long. His smile flickered. Worked on you? Elena, come on. I made a business decision under a lot of stress. I panicked about the tax situation and I said things about Harold I shouldn't have said. That's not some grand conspiracy. That's a man who was scared. You forged my signature on a $250,000 loan, I said. You structured $140,000 through a shell company, so it would look like theft if it ever surfaced. And you made sure your own brother's name was the one attached to it, not yours. That's not panic, Walter. Panic doesn't need a notary. Dwight's name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Walter's eyes cut, fast and involuntary, toward the doorway where Bailey and Paige were standing, both of them very still. Dwight doesn't know what he's talking about, Walter said, but his voice had lost its warmth entirely now, gone flat and clipped. He signed those papers himself. Nobody held a gun to his head. He signed papers you told him were a formality, I said. You told him it protected the family. What it actually did was make sure that if any of this ever went to court, he'd be the one explaining wire transfers to a federal investor investigator instead of you. You used your own brother as a fall guy, Walter. The man who's been living in your basement for 5 years, eating cash payroll you handed him like a favor, and the whole time you were building a case that would put him in front of a judge instead of you. That's not, Walter started, and then Harold quietly set a folder on the counter and slid it toward Diane. Dwight's signed statement, the recorded call, the notarized affidavit. Walter looked at it the way a man looks at a door closing from the wrong side. Dad, Bailey's voice from the doorway, small in a way I hadn't heard since she was maybe 11 years old. Is that true? Did you really do that to Uncle Dwight? Walter turned to her, and for just a second I watched him try on the old performance one more time, the wounded reasonableness, the please just trust me warmth that had carried him through 21 years of my own silence. It didn't land. I could see it not landing, could see something in Bailey's face going hard and clear in real time, the particular expression of a daughter watching her father's mask slip and realizing all at once that the mask had been the whole face for longer than she wanted to admit. You told me Mom was having an affair, Bailey said. You told me that 3 days ago, and I believed you, and I went and humiliated myself in front of a stranger because you needed someone else to be the villain so badly that you were willing to use me to do it. Bailey, it's more complicated than— Stop, she said, and her voice cracked on the word, but she didn't stop talking. Stop explaining. I don't want an explanation. I want you to just once, one time in your whole life, say the true thing without wrapping it in something that makes you look better. Walter didn't say the true thing. He stood in his own kitchen, surrounded by a forensic accountant's folder, and his lawyer's silence and his daughter's faces, and instead of the true thing he reached for anger, because anger was the only tool he had left once the charm stopped working. You want the true thing? He said, and his voice rose for the first time since I'd walked in. The true thing is, I built something in this town from nothing, and everyone in this family treated it like it belonged to them just because they happened to be standing nearby when it happened. I don't owe anybody an apology for protecting what's mine. It was never only yours, I said, quiet, because I'd waited 21 years to say this next part, and I didn't need to shout it. I put $62,000 into that clinic in 2005. I worked 6 years of overnight shifts so you could keep the lights on while it grew. I kept your books at my kitchen table after midnight while you slept. Grant Whitmore refused to take my name off that lease in 2006 when you asked him to, and I never even knew you'd asked until 3 days ago, when I found the letter in a dead man's filing cabinet. You've been trying to erase me since the 2nd year of our marriage, Walter. You just finally got good enough at it to almost finish the job. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's sprinkler ticked on. The same ordinary Tuesday afternoon sound the whole world had kept making while my marriage came apart in the kitchen. It had been renovated by money he'd never once acknowledged as mine. I need you to hear this clearly, because I'm only going to say it once, I said, looking at him. Not at Diane or Harold or the girls, just at him, the man I'd married at 26, believing driven men build things that last. I'm not the villain in this story, and I'm not the victim either. I'm the person who kept the receipts. Everything you built on top of things I paid for and time I gave up and silences I agreed to keep. You don't get to erase that just because it's inconvenient to remember. And you don't get to hand your own brother to a courtroom to keep your name clean. That's who you actually are, Walter, not the man who cuts ribbons. This. Walter's lawyer finally spoke, quiet and careful, suggesting they table the conversation and let the attorneys handle the rest through proper channels. Walter didn't argue. He didn't have anything left to argue with. He sat down at the kitchen island, the same island where he'd once told me I always had an agenda, and put his head in his hands, and for the first time in 21 years, I watched my husband look genuinely, completely lost, with no audience left who believed the performance. The weeks after, the kitchen fell apart faster than I expected and slower than I needed. Diane filed criminal referral paperwork alongside the civil injunction, and within 10 days, the district attorney's office had opened an inquiry into the forged deed of trust, with Trent Holloway as the notary of record facing the sharpest scrutiny of anyone involved. Trent, it turned out, had a prior complaint against his notary license from 2019, a minor infraction he'd talked his way out of, and this time there was no talking his way out of anything. He lost his commission within a month and hired his own lawyer, and word came back through Dwight that Trent had started cooperating fully, rather than risk facing the forgery charge alone. The clinic itself became its own small war. Walter's business lawyer argued initially that Crestline belonged to him as the founding practitioner, that my $62,000 and 6 years of overnight freight shifts amounted to a spousal contribution rather than true ownership. Grant Whitmore's ledger and the 2006 letter, with his red ink refusal, ended that argument within a single mediation session. Diane later told me the mediator had actually laughed, not unkindly, at how thoroughly a dead landlord's filing habits had settled a case that would otherwise have dragged through a full year of litigation. I didn't want the clinic. I want to be honest about that too, because there's a version of this story where the wronged wife seizes the business and runs it triumphantly into the sunset, and that was never going to be my ending. I'd spent enough of my life keeping someone else's books. What I wanted was what was fair, converted into something I could actually use to build a life that belonged to me alone. Diane negotiated a settlement instead. Half the clinic's assessed value, paid out over 18 months, plus full restitution on the $140,000 once the criminal case resolved, plus a court order voiding voiding the forged deed of trust entirely, which meant the house, at least, came back to solid ground. Bailey moved in with Susan and me for 6 weeks that fall, unable to look at her father without seeing the kitchen scene replay behind her eyes, she told me once, late at night, both of us on Susan's back porch with mugs of tea going cold. She apologized for the email more times than I needed her to. I told her, eventually, that she didn't owe me the apology anymore, that I understood exactly how a person raised inside a performance learns to trust the performance over the evidence, because I'd spent 21 years doing the same thing myself. Paige stayed closer to neutral longer than her sister did, which I understood too. She was 20, still building her own separate life, and grief doesn't move at the same speed in every child of the same marriage. She visited her father twice that fall, came back both times quieter than usual, and eventually told me she'd stopped going because it felt like visiting someone auditioning for a part instead of talking to her dad. Walter had taken an apartment above a dry cleaner off 3rd Street, a mile from the clinic he no longer fully controlled, and according to Paige, he'd started telling a version of the story at a men's group he'd joined, where he was the one who'd been blindsided by an ambush he never saw coming. Some people, I've learned, will edit their own history right up to the moment they die, and there's nothing you can do about that except refuse to let their edit become the only copy that survives. Marisol, the clinic's longtime receptionist, called Diane's office unprompted in early October, after word of the DA's inquiry had made its way through the small circle of people who worked front desk shifts at Cresslene. She'd kept her own informal log for years, she said, dates and amounts for every cash payroll envelope Walter had handed Dwight under the table, because she'd learned a long time ago in a previous job that unofficial money has a way of becoming somebody else's official problem eventually, and she preferred not to be that somebody. Her notes matched Harold's reconstructed numbers almost exactly. She apologized for not saying more to me sooner, back when she'd mentioned it once at a barbecue and then backed away from the subject. I didn't think it was my place, she told me, the two of us sitting in her car outside the clinic on her lunch break. I think I was wrong about that. I'm sorry it took a court filing for me to say so. I thanked her, and meant it, and thought again about how many small, quiet witnesses a marriage accumulates without ever asking their permission to watch. The logistics of untangling 21 years took longer than any of the emotional reckonings did. There was a retirement account to split, a car loan still in both our names, a storage unit full of furniture from the house we eventually sold that neither of us particularly wanted, but both of us had opinions about anyway. Diane handled most of it with the patient efficiency of someone who'd clearly done this exact math 100 times before. But even patient efficiency takes months when there's a forged deed of trust, a pending criminal referral, and a business valuation all moving through the courts on separate, overlapping timelines. I signed more documents that fall than I had in the entire 21 years of the marriage combined, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I read every single line before I put my name on it. Roger and Wendy drove up from Portland twice that October, once for a dinner where Wendy hugged me at the door before I'd even said hello, and once just to help me move Susan's spare furniture into the little rental I'd found on the east side of Bend, a 2-bedroom with a small fenced yard and a kitchen that had nobody's ribbon-cutting photo in it. Roger didn't say much about the 14 years of silence between us. He just showed up twice, with his truck and his tools and a case of the good beer, and some things don't need to be talked through to be repaired. Some things just need someone to show up twice. There was a night in late October, alone in the new rental, boxes still half unpacked, when the grief finally caught up with me in a way the anger never had. I sat on the kitchen floor because I hadn't unpacked the chairs yet, and I cried for the version of Walter I'd married at 26, the one who talked about building something that mattered and meant it, or at least meant it enough that I believed him for 21 years. That man was gone, if he'd ever fully existed at all, replaced somewhere along the way by someone willing to forge his wife's signature and sacrifice his own brother rather than face a hard conversation honestly. I mourned him anyway. You're allowed to mourn a person even after you've learned the truth about who they actually were, maybe especially then. Dwight avoided a formal charge in the end, cooperating fully enough that the DA's office treated him as a witness rather than a co-conspirator, though his credit and his name stayed tangled in the fallout for the better part of a year. He texted me on Thanksgiving, the first one after everything, just a short message. Hope you're doing okay. Thank you for not hating me completely. I told him I didn't hate him at all, and I meant it, though I also didn't invite him to dinner, and he didn't ask me to. 14 months later, I live in that same rental on the east side of Bend, though I own it now, closed on it with my share of the settlement in the spring. I work part-time doing books for 2 small businesses downtown, careful, precise work that I'm good at and that nobody has ever once asked me to hide. Bailey calls most weeks. Paige comes home from Eugene on breaks and sleeps in the 2nd bedroom, and we've started a small, unspoken tradition of cooking dinner together the first night she's back. Nothing fancy, just something with our hands busy enough that talking comes easier. I planted tomatoes again this past May in raised beds along the back fence of my own yard, the kind you water on your own schedule because nobody else is going to remind you and nobody else needs to. I water them most evenings now, not because a legal pad told me to, but because I like watching things grow that belong entirely to me. I think about that morning in the driveway sometimes, the 2 SUVs, the snowboards I paid for, Walter jogging up the steps to hand me a chore list instead of an invitation. For a long time, I thought the worst part was being left behind. I understand it differently now. The worst part wasn't the retreat at all. It was how long I'd already been disappearing before that morning ever arrived, one reasonable request at a time, until a man could stand in front of me and genuinely believe a list about tomatoes was an adequate substitute for a marriage. I don't know if Walter understands, even now, what he actually lost. I've stopped needing him to. What I know is this: a person can spend 21 years making themselves smaller for someone else's comfort, and it will never once be enough, because the goal was never comfort. The goal was room. Someone else's room, made bigger by the space you agreed to stop taking up. I take up space now. My kitchen has no ribbon-cutting photo missing my face from the corner. My name is on every account, every document, every lease that matters. It cost me a marriage I gave 21 years to, and some nights that cost still aches in a way I don't expect anyone to fully understand unless they've hated themselves. I lost the version of my family I thought I was building. I lost a husband I loved honestly, even if he never quite managed to love me the same way back. That loss is real, and I don't pretend otherwise. Not even now. Not even with tomatoes coming in heavy and red along my own back fence in the last warm week of September. But I'm here. I'm the one who waters them.